Good afternoon. Welcome to the second plenary session of SIWW2021 Spotlight. This afternoon's session will focus on the theme, Riding the Wave, Ensuring Security Against Climate Uncertainties. To tell us more about this session, we have the moderator, Mr. Scott Dunn, Vice President of Strategy and Growth in Asia at AECOM. For this plenary session, we will be using the Q&A and chat functions located to the right of the screen. We invite you to drop your questions or vote on the question that you'd like to see answered during the Q&A segment. Scott, the time is yours.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome, and thank you everyone for joining the session. My name is Scott Dunn, Chief Strategic Officer for AECOM's Asia business. Now, this session will examine how different stakeholders leveraging innovation to implement innovative solutions to help us safeguard our water systems against the shocks and uncertainties caused by climate change. During the session, we'll hear from our distinguished panel on lessons that they have learned from current strategies encompassing areas such as public policy, social programs, technology and engineering innovation, industrial and international collaborations, as well as decarbonization priorities. Now, due to the size of the panel, we've decided to split the opening intervention into two panels. With the first panel, we'll approach the core topic of uncertainty related to innovation around solutions in government, policy, and capacity building, which will create a framework of resilience. Our second panel will then approach the topic of innovation related to the physical built environment. So for the first panel, I have the distinguished pleasure of introducing our esteemed speakers. And I first start with Ahmed Abatelet, who's the mayor of Rotterdam. And he is serving in his third elective term and has led a wide and comprehensive resilience program for the city, which has also included alliances with Resilient Cities Network, the C40, and 1,000 Cities Adaptation Now program. He joins us from Rotterdam. Our second speaker will be Professor Haman Kassan, who's the General Manager for RAND Water and the Vice President for the International Water Association. He brings his experience with RAND Water, who are the largest water utility in Africa, providing water to over 11 million people. He also has a leadership role with the International Water Association, who have members in 140 countries and form the largest international network of water professionals. He joins us from Johannesburg today. Welcome, Professor Kassan. Third, we'll hear from Carlos Cosan, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Almar Water Solutions and the President of the International Desalination Association. Almar Water Solutions is a leading global water infrastructure development business with a focus on the Middle East, Africa, and South America. As president of the International Desalination Association, he also oversees the world's leading resources for information and professional development exclusively focused on desalination and water use technologies. He's joining us today from Madrid. And finally, within our first panel is Mr. Chiu Min Leung, who's the president of Urban Solutions of ST Engineering and the president of the Singapore Water Association. Now with ST Engineering, he's leading the group's global smart city business in the areas of utilities, infrastructure, and sustainable solutions. Now, Mr. Chiu is also extremely influential in the formation of Singapore's urban landscape during his previous positions as the chief executive of both the Singapore Land Transport Authority and the Public Utility Board. He's joining us today from Singapore. Now with that, I would like to hand the time and the screen over to the Mayor of Rotterdam for your opening intervention. Mayor?
Morning in Europe and good afternoon in Singapore. Thank you for inviting me again to share with you some thoughts from the policy of the city of Rotterdam. What I learned last 12 years being in office in a Delta city, having the largest port in the Western Hemisphere, with billions and billions of investments in the port that are not protected by dikes and levees, what I learned is that water equals special planning. You may also reverse it and say special planning equals water. So in Rotterdam, we have to deal with a number of big issues concerning water. We face problems with water coming from the rivers, from Germany, from France, from the Alps. We have problems with the North Sea if there is high wind. We have problems with surface water and, of course, with rainwater. So we face 4 dimensions of threat. So the only approach that is really working for the city of Rotterdam is integration of these philosophies. Disciplines like blue policy, green policy, health policy, social functionalities all together in one approach that we called in Rotterdam weather-wise, and aims to tackle the negative effects of the extreme climate change. It's not only about technical solutions, but also about the philosophy, how to change, for instance, the behavior of the industry and the behavior of our citizens themselves, but also to add green spaces into the city. Recently, we decided to add 7 major green 7 lungs to the city with a budget of 300 million euros, and that in times of crisis, so we had to make a big choice to add a lot of green spaces and also to make it easy for citizens to reach green areas within 10 minutes walk. So that how we add 14 square kilometers of green roofs, also to work on transforming black roofs into green roofs to help with heat stress in the city. And work also on public-private cooperation, as 60% of the land is not in hands of the city, but in private hands, like housing corporation, the industry, for instance. So they have also to do something in terms of harvesting the water and reusing the water. Together with AVIDES, that is our water utility board, we increase circularity of the water. You may imagine the city of Rotterdam has 3 football clubs and they all have their own football stadiums. You may follow the European Championship now. One of the stadiums, we have a big space where we store the water to reuse it in times of drought. So reusing water is also a big issue. But we really think in Rotterdam that the future lays in adaptation. We believe that we cannot win from Mother Nature, whether it's rain or river water or the North Sea. So we have to prepare for the future, not to prepare for the uncertainties. What is uncertain, but integrating adaptation in all policies that we do in the concerning land change is really important to work on adaptation. Prepare that the Mother Nature is too heavy. We cannot win from Mother Nature, so be prepared by adapting your solutions. Also by simple things, for instance. We encourage our citizens to remove in their own immediate vicinity, like their own gardens, for instance, to remove a tile, 2, 3, 4, and to replace it by plants or flowers. We have even a national championship on that, to remove tiles and to replace that by plants or flowers. And that's how we add 19 kilometers of tiny gardens in the city of Rotterdam. So again, as long as water is a big threat for the city of Rotterdam, and water is our life, think of the port that is adding 7% to the GDP, and it's not protected by dikes and levees. We have really to take measures in terms of adapting to survive the future and to survive in a delta that is really, really high density. We have a lot of people living here, and the economy of Europe depends on the port of Rotterdam, as we serve 500 million consumers from Rotterdam. We have no choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And it's interesting to see water equals special planning and how that special planning can actually penetrate across all the stakeholders in the city. I think we'll come back to that point later on in our discussion. Now, if I could turn to Professor Kassan, who's bringing his experience from Africa. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate the opportunity. Greetings to all, whichever time zone you're sitting in. For me, it's in the morning here. For Singapore, it's in the afternoon. I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg in my office, South Africa, where we have just declared the third wave of the COVID virus. So we're challenged not only with COVID, but also with climate change. And that's what the topic for today is. So allow me to share with you some of the experience and the situation in the African continent. We have some 45 countries in this continent. It is a continent that is water stressed, particularly South Africa is water stressed. We are vulnerable to multiple stresses in terms of climate variability and impacts. And of course, it is well documented and known that our adaptive capacity to recover is low and requires assistance in terms of improving. Now, South Africa is not only stressed in terms of water, but we also have challenges with electrical supply. So we have some experience of how we run utilities and ensure supply of water in the midst of climate change challenges, electrical supply challenges, pandemics, etc. And we're learning every day. The interesting thing about South Africa is we do have a policy. We have a climate resilience policy, which has been formulated for the country. And the vision of this policy is to transition to climate resilient South Africa, which allows a sustainable development path guided by anticipation, adaptation, and recovery from a changing climate and environment to achieve our development aspirations. There are 4 strategic objectives. Very briefly, these are building a climate resilience and adaptive capacity to respond to climate change risk and vulnerability, promote integration of climate change, adaptation response into development objectives, policy planning and implementation, which are important, improve understanding of climate change impacts and capacity to respond to these impacts going forward, given our development status, ensure resources and systems are in place to enable implementation of climate change responses. There are 9 strategic interventions and 9 outcomes. I won't go into that detail for now, but I think most importantly, water has been prioritized and the impacts of water. So we're looking at aspects of higher water demand. We're looking at variability in rainfall, which is expected, deteriorating water quality. Utilities and municipalities have climate change response plans, which is good news, and strategies with adaptation and mitigation strategies. Climate change impacts have been flagged on risk registers at utilities and municipalities. So these are on the radar of the governance structures, like your board subcommittees, the board that looks at the risk mitigation approaches. And the plans are essentially focused on integrated planning for water-sensitive design, addressing high levels of non-revenue water, which is prevalent in the continent, green and clean energy to reduce carbon emissions, human health and social well-being, reduce pollution and improve water quality. Then we're looking at diversification of water resources, groundwater in particular, recycling, desalination, importantly, on the coastal region, and rainwater harvesting as another technique. Wastewater treatment technologies are being looked at in terms of the latest, improving efficiency in traditional approaches of water supply. All utilities are reviewing their approaches, investing in research and development and technology mobilization. Now, if I can very quickly provide some case studies, some examples of what I think would resonate with people across the world. Let's talk about Cape Town briefly, because it's part of South Africa. Many of you would have been aware of the day zero about 2 years ago in Cape Town. Well, Cape Town now has developed a strong resilience strategy, which is focused on water reuse, the use of groundwater and aquifers now. Additional surface water is being mobilized, and importantly, desalination, given that they lie on the coastal region. More inland in the largest city in the continent, which is Johannesburg, and our province. We have augmentation of water from a neighboring country, Lesotho, which gets pumped via channels. Phase 2 is now in preparation. Water saving plumbing has been initiated. Drip irrigation has been prioritized because agriculture is a large user in this region. Waste prevention and recycling, solar energy, groundwater, hydropower turbines is something that we're looking at implementing in the utility, rainwater harvesting, and partnering with many of the municipalities. We're looking at recycling of water to assist the municipalities and work in collaboration, in partnership. One or two examples very quickly from the African continent. We have Tanzania, which has implemented solar water supply through irrigation for irrigation practice, which is great. Kenya, strongly looking at rainwater harvesting. In Ghana, there are community wells. And in Mali, there's dam and habitat restoration, to give you some flavor. Some innovation in terms of capacity building at our utility at Rand Water. We have a number of professorial chairs that we engage and enlist in order for us to stay up to speed with the best technologies and expertise. Well, I'm happy to say that one of these professorial chairs we're looking at engaging is in the field of climate change. So clearly, this is a priority matter for us going forward in terms of sustained water supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kassan. Interesting points, especially around the involvement of the whole community in helping to solve some of these issues. And again, I think that overlaps a bit with what the mayor's comments were across stakeholder engagement. If now we can turn to Carlos Kassan and hear some of your opening intervention remarks. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your introduction, and thank you for the organization of the Singapore International Water Week once more time to invite us for these interesting discussions. I'm preparing some points that I want to remark regarding what has been done in the past in the innovation in governance and policy in one specific topic, which is the reuse of the treated wastewater. Okay, and I try to centralize the message in this plan in this area because probably the non-conventional water treatment, desalination and reuse, and especially water reuse that has already mentioned before, is the only way to generate these new resources as alternative sources of water that is, I think, more reliable, cost-effective, and environmental friendly than the traditional raw water sources that we have been using in the past. Okay, and as we know, the main challenges that the regions are facing to meet the long-term water needs are water scarcity and climate change, and I think the reuse is one of the fundamental solutions for the future. And regarding these topics, I want to point out three significant progress that has been made in terms of technology and regulation for cities that I think has really success stories. One is Singapore, the other is United States, and the third is Europe. Singapore, which is hosting today in this Water Week, is a pioneer of non-conventional water solutions. Through this new water company, it recycles wastewater into the clean, ultra clean, high water, reclaimed water, buffering its water supplies against drought and moving Singapore really towards water sustainability. The country has these 5 new water plants that supply nowadays 40% of the current Singapore's water needs. And I read it and discuss it with, because Singapore POV is partner of IDA, that by 2060, new water is expected to meet up to 55 of the Singapore future water demand, which for me is a formidable news, okay? Also, I want to remark, coming from California, that the United States stands out of one of the fish countries that has been regulated the reuse for water consumption. what they call this purified water. And the water goes through a series of cleaning processes depending of the origin and the sources, filtration and disinfection, and produce, for me, highest quality that undergoes rigorous testing for monitoring on a daily basis, okay? And the water consistently meets and sometimes exceeds all public health standards, which is something that very difficult to understand in any other countries, but I think is a reality that is now extensively used in and followed by any other countries. Especially in line with this, important also the work that the Environmental Protection Agency and its federal partners published in the National Water Reuse Action Plan report that it was published in February 2020 that has been also used for the directive in Europe. That is my third important point, okay? Because Europe in April 2020, after more than 5 years of discussions in the European community, approved a new regulation that facilitates the use of the treated urban wastewater for agricultural irrigation, which at the end reducing the risk of the water shortages, especially in the southern countries in Europe for the crop irrigation, and also helping Europe to adapt to the consequences of the climate change, okay? This regulation, which is fully in line with the circular economy, improves clearly the availability of the water and will promote its efficient use. These new regulations, just to give some figures, will reuse up to 6.6 billion cubic meters a day in 2025, which is multiplied by 6 the actual water treatment or reuse in Europe, and will require an investment of less than 700 million euros. For me, I think it's important because also will reduce more than 5% of the direct extraction from the water bodies on groundwater, okay? And just to finalize these 3 cases that there is a lot to talk about the public institution, but behind all of them, there is the advice and execution of private companies, thanks to the experience and knowledge gained after leading the water market for decades. The public-private partnerships have become one of the most practical and widespread tools for scaling up and expanding the technology and the water supply in many geographical areas. And it's important to remark areas that, as Algeria, Oman, or Saudi Arabia, are countries where this PPP has succeeded in developing unconventional national water schemes, enable cities and industry to grow. And just to finalize, although the regulation of the reused water is moving slower than I expected, or we expected, in the case of technologies, it will continue to advance progressively with the help and collaboration of all the leaders in the sector and expand to the other countries where this is currently not considered. Just to be familiar that the total water reuse in the world is 4%, when cases, as I mentioned, in Singapore or Israel, is in the levels of higher than 60%. Then we have a very good optimism for the future regarding this uncertainty in the water supply. Thank you. This is my main message.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think that's a critical point in terms of how to move the 4% higher. And definitely, I think the 3 case examples you gave all had strong policy behind those changes. So I think we can get into that a little bit in terms of what's needed in other jurisdictions. With that, I will turn it over to our last speaker for the first panel, Mr. Chu. Your interventions, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. A very good morning or afternoon to everybody. I just want to share 3 very specific, I think, areas where policy and regulatory innovations are evolving in cities and key jurisdictions today, with regards to enhancing the resilience of water resources against climate uncertainties. 3 areas. One, is on persistent demand reduction, and I'll talk about that later. 2 is about strengthening the resiliency or resilience of water sources, especially through recycling. And 3, I want to talk about decarbonizing water treatment. So first up, on persistent demand reduction. I think the biggest trend in water over the last decade, as we know, is really about digitalization of the entire water chain, occurring in different degrees, in different parts of the world, in different parts of the water system. Today, digital networks and IoT has actually come together to provide, I think, very pervasive digital tracking of water production, delivery, and usage. This enables actually governments and utilities to do the one thing with much greater accuracy and extent, to track water usage footprint, understand the trends and underlying causal factors for homes, for townships, for cities. This gives very extensive knowledge. So cities and utilities can leverage on this knowledge to set persistent reduction targets over time and work with all stakeholders to see how they can ramp up water use efficiency. I don't need to tell you that a world of ever-increasing water use efficiency will build greater resilience, obviously, to shocks of climate change. Now, second, on strengthening resiliency of water resources. I think we all understand that a critical safeguard against climate change shocks is really to take stock of the resilience of water resources for any cities and any jurisdiction. And of course, with the understanding, try to build new means in collaboration with industry to see how they raise the resilience. I would encourage any city or jurisdiction to actually take a systems view, conduct a very open and frank audit of the actual resilience of the water resources, where the city stands, and then work that to build up long-term plans to strengthen the resilience of both existing sources and also build new ones. And on building new resilient water sources, I think recycling has been mentioned many times. But I would say that we need to now take a view that recycling can be an important new innovation for cities and jurisdictions. In fact, I think as Carlos has mentioned, so in Singapore and Israel, we have basically made recycling an obsession, and we have actually driven the level of recycling to 60%, but the rest of the world stands at 4%. So it's quite obvious that recycling as a resilient water source has not really been so well optimized on the world stage. So what I want to suggest is that cities and jurisdictions should now look at recycling really as a new obsession. And when we say recycling, you talk about recycling within the industries and also recycling within the city. And for the city, I think there needs to be consideration to see how they can invest in wastewater collection network at scale. And only when you are able to collect wastewater at scale would any city be able to move the needle on recycling. But last and not least, really on the subject of recycling, consider opening up to industry collaboration in order to build technology-enabled infrastructure for recycling. Basically, incentivize recycling across the industries, incentivize the adoption of technology to build recycling at the systems level, and even consider building up calibrated recycling, essentially fit for purpose recycling for specific use, so that you don't have to gold plate all recycling in order to generate the purest water form. And last but not least, decarbonizing water. Yes, I think we want to see how we can reduce water demand. I think we want to see how to strengthen resilience of water resources. But I think increasingly we cannot run away from the need to measure the carbon footprint of per volume of water that is treated for use in the city or at the jurisdiction. In fact, they need to build greater consciousness to reduce the energy used to generate water. And with that, help contribute essentially lowering the carbon emissions in the water chain. And this actually does require policy, regulatory, as well as technology innovation. So I think cities may do well to start thinking about introducing carbon targets for water treatment. Drive technology investment focusing on the reduction of energy usage in water treatment. In fact, why not make it even our obsession? And with that, think about fostering an ecosystem to help spawn new technologies that will persistently bring down carbon footprint of water. So not only do we want to reduce the use of water, not only do we want to increase the resilience of the water sources, but think about how to reduce the carbon footprint of the water that is going to be used within the city and the jurisdiction. And with that, I think we can help build better resilience within cities and jurisdictions against climate uncertainties. Thanks.
Thank you, Man Long. Actually, I mean, so you also brought up the issues of water recycling and reusing, trying to create more circular economy within water.
Yeah.
And actually, if I can kind of bring this back to the mayor and some of your points in terms of, the city of Rotterdam, I guess there's two sides to this. One is, your sources of water, you mentioned, also are coming cross-jurisdictional from other borders. And maybe some comments on what you've been able to do related to the policy change that's been needed and how much of the city actually deals with some of that recycling of the water as compared to a flow through. And then the second part to that question, I guess, is the examples so far are more in, I'd say, the developed economies, which have typically more capital to put to use for some of these types of policies to be able to get behind that from multiple stakeholders. So is there some lessons that can be learned in terms of, especially on that agricultural use, I guess, in terms of how you can be able to recycle urban water systems for not just their urban environment, but maybe some of that goes into other less quality treated water, agriculture or industrial or other uses. So maybe, Mayor, if you could start in terms of maybe some of the things that Rotterdam has been doing related to this.
Yeah, thank you. We recycle all the water that is coming from the sewage system, all of it. It's an obligation by law. We're not allowed to dump the water in the rivers, for instance, without cleaning it up. So we clean the water of the sewage system up to a degree of some 98%. So not water that you can drink. Even if it is an obligation by law, there is something difficult as the philosophy and the feeding of the people, whether they can drink recycled water. So in the meantime, we use the recycled water for the industry. And as you may know, we have one of the highest industrial clusters in the port with some 5 major refineries and some 2,000 other petrochemical sites. If you know the port of Singapore, then you have an imagination of what Rotterdam is. It's a bit similar size. So a lot of water is used for the industry. And the other thing is talking about adaptation is that we started recently when we lay down new pipelines for the sewage system and we replace 40 kilometers a year, that we lay down a double system, double tubes for the sewage system. The one as the traditional one and the other one to harvest the rainwater, so that we have a complete gray, we'll call it a gray water system to be used for instance, for toilets and for washing and for gardening and whatever. So there is a high efficiency when it comes to using water and clean it up to a very high degree. But we're not that far, as for instance, Namibia, where people are drinking recycled water. We don't do that. It's really so far a step too far for citizens to accept that.
I mean, the double sewage system, Professor Kassan, would that work South Africa? Oh, you're on mute still.
Thank you. Yes, there is potential for that to work here. I might say that it was very eloquently presented that the 3 issues are demand reduction, recycling, and carbon neutrality is what we need to go towards. From our experience in the continent and my own experience globally, my sense is that I don't think that there's a lack of technology. If you look at the first water total recycling plant in the world was built in Namibia, Southwest Africa, in the early 1960s. Now, the world didn't make a quantum leap since then. I mean, the next one that was mentioned, case in point, was Singapore, which is partially recycled. The next case that was mentioned was the west coast of Africa in the California region, right? So my sense is the technology is there. I think that to some extent, the policy, regulatory environment, the political will, the financing mechanisms, the public-private partnerships, which need to be put in place here in order for us to move the world more towards the 60% from the 4% where we are, is where we ought to be mobilizing, action amongst the different countries in order for us to have a sustainable future. Indeed.
Yeah, Professor Kassan, is that possible, you think, at a city scale in terms of the African continent, or is that really needed at a country level in terms of a national policy and change?
My own sense is it's possible at a city scale and even on a smaller scale, as long as the political will is there, the interest is there. I think that the collaborations are happening already, and there are many countries and other municipalities that are prepared to help via the collaborations in terms of best practice, the use of technologies. So it's possible. Indeed, I think that we have cases, if you look at across the world, for example, on the topic of reducing non-revenue water, we've seen that some municipalities in the world have done phenomenal work merely by change of leadership and the regulatory environment.
Because I think that's something like Min Long in Singapore, it's a city state, so it has certain alignment in terms of being able to really push that. I guess, how do you see some of the lessons learned that are applicable to other cities that, have a much stronger separation between state and city?
Well,
sorry, maybe Professor Kassan, maybe turn to Mr. Chu.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. I must say, I don't think the lessons learned by Singapore can always be directly be applied for cities or jurisdictions around the world. But I think the Singapore experience is instructive from the perspective that if you essentially set your mind to actually strengthening the resilience of the water resource through recycling, I think all policies actually will align to that direction. So when Singapore first started looking at essentially building up the overall wastewater collection system, I must say that there was, I think, some thinking that has gone into it to make it a system that is able to collect as much of the wastewater as possible. Even at the time when water recycling was not totally clear, but the decision was taken then. And as a result, you actually have the infrastructure to allow for recycling to be done at scale. So what I'm trying to say is that I think for cities and jurisdictions out there, I think today you have the benefit of the lessons learned by other cities. Why not look at recycling really as an obsession and start from there? High-level system thinking, high-level planning, and then determine how we can actually build infrastructure to achieve that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I think interesting open comments. Actually, we went, I think, beyond a little bit on the policy side and a little bit into the physical built environment with some recommendations and solutions from great, backyard harvesting through to double sewage systems, into other ways in which we can create better recycling. But interesting, because I think that the policy side actually drives that in a lot of cities. I mean, even in Singapore with allowing for water to be reused at a local level with individuals, took quite a bit of terms of change. So it's step by step, I think, in many cities. So thank you, everyone, for your opening remarks on the first panel. Now I'd like to turn to our second panel. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers. We have three that will be speaking on panel 2, starting with Mr. Tan Boon Leng, who's the Managing Director of Kepler Infrastructure. Kepler Infrastructure provides a wide range of water solutions as an owner and operator of desalination, water reuse, and wastewater treatment facilities. Mr. Tan also brings extensive experience of implementing infrastructure and utility projects across China as well as Southeast Asia. He's based in Singapore. Then we'll hear from Steve Clark, who's the Chief Executive Officer of SUEZ Asia. SUEZ is a global leader in developing and running water infrastructure. They have over 70 joint ventures with local partners and have built over 600 plus water and wastewater plants, with 32 million people benefiting from this work. Mr. Clark is directly responsible for the group's overall Asia water business. He's normally in Hong Kong. Today, he's calling from London. And finally, we'll hear from Richard Thurfall, who is the global head of KPMG Impact and the global head of KPMG's Infrastructure Advisory Group, where he's involved in some of the most complex water infrastructure engineering projects across multiple regions. In his role for KPMG Impact, he assists clients in delivering on United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, their ESG commitments, and creating greater sustainable impact across the company. He's calling us from just outside of London. So welcome to my second panel, and we'll be moving more into the physical infrastructure perspective from our panel. And with that, Mr. Tan, I'd like to turn it over to you for your opening intervention. Mr. Tan?
Thanks, Scott. Yes, I'm Boon from Kepler Infrastructure. Happy to join this afternoon's discussion on the water business. Kepler Infrastructure is part of the Kepler Group. Kepler puts sustainability at the core of its Vision 2030. Kepler Sequestration under the Kepler Infrastructure is the Singapore leading solutions provider for sustainable environment, not only in the water solutions, but also in waste management solutions. Kepler Infrastructure got itself into this water business, or the environmental business for the matter, almost 20 years ago. We had the privilege to execute many major water projects in Singapore, Qatar, and China. In Singapore, we have been lucky that we could work with a very driven agency like PUB to solve the urgent and complex Singapore water problem. We started working on the Singapore third tap new water, which is a recycling of water, without small participation in the design and build of the Bedok new water plant for PUB. And then we move on to the first design, build, own and operate projects, the 32 MIGD Ulu Pandan new water plant in 2005. Then we work also with PUB on the first pilot variable salinity plant at the Bedok plant in 2004. And then 10 years into the operation of the Ulu Pandan plant in 2016, we actually proposed to PUB to upgrade the Ulu Pandan plant and completed the upgrade to increase the RO recovery rate to almost 90% and boost the capacity by another 10%. It was interesting. We in Singapore really makes every drop counts. And most recently, we officially opened the Kepler Marina East Desalination Plant. And this is a unique project and it's innovative because it is a Singapore first large-scale dual-mode desalination plant. And also it has this dual use of space by building essentially the whole facility underground and return the surface back to the park, as for the community. And then also it's introduced energy-saving features like the direct coupling to reduce the energy loss in the pumping cycle and make it a lot more efficient in producing the water. This is another innovative milestone for the fourth tap under the PUB water system. PUB has come a long way and we are proud to be part of this. Going forward, it's not going to be less challenging here, but we will make sure that we are more energy efficient in our water production and we will do it in a way that has the least impact to the environment. Okay, and one key point I want to highlight is the importance of this feedback loop in the know-how and engineering design and operations. We observed that some projects fail to deliver the intended results or improvement could be due to a gap in this area. And then we pride ourselves as a partner to our client on a long-term basis, either as an operator of the plant that we built or as a technical partner in helping our client monitor the performance of the plant that we design. The design conditions may change over the design life of the plant, and hence adjustments will be needed from time to time. Technological advancement may also provide or create opportunity for upgrades. The DBO, the design, build, own, operate, or DBO, the design, build, and operate structures under the various PPP schemes are very good models to help address this. The key is really the integrated approach in design, build, and operate under such contracts. We have been able to perform better working closely with our client like PUB in Singapore, in our Ulu Pandan new water plant, and now the Marina East Desalination Plant, and the National Environmental Agency for our Senoko Waste Treatment Facility and the Kepler Sequestration Incineration Facilities. Overseas too, like our Doha South Integrated Waste Management Facility since 2011, and we are now building an integrated waste management facility for the Hong Kong government, and will also be operating it under a DBO model. As an operator to this project, we were able to design our plant upfront with long-term operations and maintenance issue in mind, and we hence able to operate this plant more efficiently on a life cycle cost basis. We were able to incorporate all lessons learned from the past project into the design of our next plant and constantly looking for more innovative solutions to address any pain points. We believe that this is a good model for the development of our industry, and it should encourage innovation and performance-oriented development. Back to you, Scott. Thanks.
Thank you, Boon. It's interesting in terms of the feedback loop, and I think that's something maybe we can pick up with the associations, with 3 representatives of various water associations in terms of how they handle that feedback to a much larger constituents of water leaders. Now, if I turn over to Steve Clark for your intervention, please.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and hello to everybody from around the world. It's clear, Scott, that during the last few years, the climate-related events have not only increased in terms of frequency, but also its severity, and it's impacting cities and the infrastructure, whether that's with flooding, whether it's with droughts, and in the Asian region, we've had quite a few typhoons impacting many countries. Now, most of the previous speakers have spoken quite rightly about improving the infrastructure, increasing the capacity, increasing the size of it. However, if you're in a mature city such as Rotterdam or Hong Kong or Singapore, these infrastructure projects are problematic. Or not only are they very expensive, but to implement major construction projects in cities like that, it's disruptive to the population. So it's expensive and it's disruptive. And politicians are reluctant sometimes to go along that route. Now, from Suez, this is our business. We plan, we construct, and we manage such projects, such assets. However, one better solution, we believe, or that can accompany this, is to optimize existing infrastructure using smart solutions. So it's relatively cheap. It's quick to implement, and it allows the efficiency to improve of the existing assets using data analysis and optimized use of the existing equipment using connected equipment. I'd like to give you 2 examples if I can, Scott. I know Mr. Tan was talking about PUB. We also work with the PUB in Singapore. Quite proud and happy to work with such an efficient organization. But I'd select 2 other locations around the world. The first is in Macau, population of about 600,000, heavily reliant on tourism. We managed as a 100% private entity, Macau Water, since 1985, working very closely with the Macau government in a partnership. The Macau government regulates and ultimately set the water tariff. So we have to work as a team in that. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, we had what we call a Typhoon 10 in that region, huge, the biggest ever, I think, on record. And it coincided with extremely high tides in the Pearl River Delta. So those 2 combined perfectly. It was the perfect storm. So Macau was flooded. Unfortunately, there were deaths in the city. It was a really bad hit. The city lost its electricity supply. So we had a major impact on our water supply. However, because we had smart solutions, we call it Aqua Advanced, superimposed upon the network, we managed to optimize the system to minimize the disruption to people. However, there was some impact. There were some losses of supply. So since that date, we've used the equipment, the Aqua Advanced system, to give us data, and we've modeled various scenarios. And we are now confident that if we had such a similar event now, there would be very, very little, if any, impact to the citizens. It allows us to be in control. And furthermore, it allows the government to be more relaxed during such major incidents. Those systems also help manage the day-to-day activities. For instance, in Macau, we managed to get the non-revenue water, one of the major issues, down to about 7%. It's one of the best in Asia, if not the world. And that optimization comes through better analysis of consumption and of long-term demands. So that's example one, where without the need to increase infrastructure, the big concrete structures, we've managed to increase the efficiency of the system. The second one, I moved to France. It's a city called Dijon, a city of about 250,000 people in France. It was the first city in France to class itself as a smart city. So once again, we formed a partnership, City being the client, but with other private operators. So we imposed our smart solutions on the water and the sewage systems. But we worked in a team with others who were managing public lighting, CCTV, traffic management, etc. Now, all of the data is collected, and we can control the systems, whether it's water or traffic management, from a central control room. Now, that gives the city incredible power during incidents where they have major impact from climate, etc. So not only to optimize the equipment, but also to communicate better with the population. It's a very, very powerful tool. And once again, if you measure the cost of that compared to a major infrastructure installation, it's tiny. It's definitely, in our opinion, the way forward.
Thank you, Steve. Actually, we'll come back to that point in terms of, I guess, full life cycle costs and the way in which you're modeling out to uncertainty. Because I think both you and Benoit have similar type of facilities that you're managing. So maybe we'll shift to Richard, and Richard will hear your intervention, and then we'll come back for the discussion. Richard?
Thanks, Scott. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I was really struck by Steve's comment about the challenges of building major infrastructure projects, particularly in cities. Having spent more than 5 years of my career working on the Thames Tideway project in London, which encountered the most significant opposition when it was originally being developed. And I think it reinforces this point that we need to do a lot more with the existing assets. And the innovation we need, I agree with a point that was made earlier, is less in the technical and more in the policy commercial space and in the application of data and digital, again, in the way that Steve was talking about a moment ago. I mean, if we stand back, the challenge is at a global level, population continues to rise. Nearly 8 billion today, will probably flatten out at around 10 or 11 billion by the end of the century. We're seeing continued push, notwithstanding COVID, towards increased urbanization of society. It was only about 35% of the population when I was born in 1970. It's up to 55% now, and is widely expected to hit 70% of the population by the time we reach 2050. And of course, rising living standards also tend to drive towards greater use of all resources, water particularly. And where this takes us to is that the biggest challenge in water, in my view, is very much water scarcity. And the solutions that we need are those which are directed at reducing that scarcity of water, and particularly by reuse and recycling in the way that's been described by others. Again, I think it was the professor that talked about the acute water scarcity in Africa as a continent and in South Africa in particular, but of course it's widespread across much of the world. And there were two areas where I think the greatest scope for progress lies. The first is around creating commercial models and incentives for wastewater reuse. KPMG are currently working on a mandate for the Water Resources Group 2030, which is looking at building out a model for wastewater reuse certification. The easiest way to describe it is to think about the carbon credit system and think about that applied across to major water consumers with what essentially would be initially a voluntary system but managed by a regulator, and that creates an exchange for the trading of credits, so that those that are more efficient in their wastewater recycling are able to be rewarded for it in an open system. And the second area is to build on, again, what Steve was starting to talk about, which is in terms of the scope for the use of digital data and analytics. I think we've only just started to scrape the surface of this. In fact, it's true to say we've only just started to scrape the surface of this across the entirety of the infrastructure space, let alone specifically in water. But we as a company are starting to see increasing approaches from organisations, public and private, for the application of data platforms across companies and whole supply chains of companies. For example, we're working in the Yarra Valley at the moment in Australia on precisely such an implementation. And the common features of most of these are two critical aspects. One is the ability to use sensor technology and aggregate the information in order to provide prior warning of asset deterioration, in order therefore to be able to provide more confidence to users and more warning when something's going to go wrong. And the second aspect is the interface with all of the stakeholders in the supply chain, but in particular with the customers, so that again you can start to guide and nudge the activity of individuals and particularly bulk users in a way that manages water most effectively.
Right.
So perhaps if I stop there, Scott, and hand back to you, and we can develop any of those.
Yeah, no, thanks, Richard. Actually, on the point, Steve, that you brought up, because I guess you're in 70 joint ventures, and I'd be interested, out of the 600 plus facilities, how many of those have you upgraded already to meet models which are around climate uncertainty in the places that those plants are in?
Yeah, those 60 or 70 GFVs, they're in mainland China, the ones you refer to, Scott. So, first of all, we started in France and in Barcelona. So Paris and Barcelona are already optimized using our smart solutions. Historically, in Macau, where we've managed since 1985, we've used it as a showcase for our Asian activities. So we've implemented everything in Macau, but we then started to use that in our GFVs in China. So we already have, the Chinese government have a project called Sponge Cities, which is in effect to make sure that the entire catchment area of the city is well connected and well used. Water is reused where possible, and floods are avoided. One of our biggest projects in China is in Chongqing, which suffers from extremely heavy rainfall. So we've introduced it also into Chongqing. We have a very good example of what we call Sponge City in Chongqing. We've also installed it in about 5 or 6 of our other joint ventures. So we can, the beauty of this is that we can superimpose these systems on our existing businesses, our existing projects, but we can also sell them to other parts of the world where we are not directly involved. So I don't know the exact numbers, Scott, but we are rolling it out, and eventually I'd like to think that in the next few years, every one of our GFVs in China will have this solution.
Because I guess, I mean, part of the challenge is with the uncertainty, it changes. The threat is different inland in Chongqing than it is in Shanghai, which is different than Jakarta or in Paris. Like the actual scenario that you're building into. So I don't know, Richard, from your perspective, what are you seeing with your clients in terms of what they're modeling to with that risk?
Yes, so well, I was very happy brought in on that, because I think we've seen huge progress over the last couple of years in terms of the sophistication of climate risk scenario planning. There are a number of tools out there in the market now. Indeed, KPMG itself is developing one at the moment, which will allow significant detail in terms of both the overlay of the geographic risk of particular areas under particular scenarios, but also mapping those onto the specifics of particular sectors and obviously particular industries that are located in those areas of risk. And it's really important because, again, to stand back and perhaps move wider than the water sector specifically, we are seeing this tremendous acceleration in the expectation on companies to provide full disclosure of all of their ESG impact on, so whether that's in terms of simple aspects of carbon emissions, or whether it's on biodiversity, or whether it's on aspects of the social as well. And the speed of this debate is such that I would say it's now our expectation as KPMG that within 5 years, at the outside 10 years, all companies everywhere will be required by law or regulation to fully disclose across their ESG footprint, in the same way as today, of course, they're expected to disclose their financial position and be expected to be audited on that as well. And I think the realization is growing in business that this is coming. But then, of course, you ask the question, what does it take in order to be able to make that disclosure effectively? And coming back to the area of water, then it is going to require really, really sophisticated understanding of the water footprint of businesses, and also the risk from water-related events to those businesses. And we're probably still a few years off all of that getting into a position where all companies, I think, are going to be confident to be able to report against it.
Right. Well, Boon Lang from Kepler Infrastructure, is that something that you're starting to now model with the different jurisdictions that you're involved with?
Actually, we have been looking at this for years. As I say, it's a forever challenge for us. It's always to look for more efficient way of doing things. In fact, just now Steve and Richard talked about the system-wide issue. I said that the first thing to do is to reduce the consumption if we can, or reduce the demand, or control the demand side. By using this morning, actually, the CEO of PUB talked about technology, using technology to help encourage a more efficient use of water. And then, of course, the second part about recycling, we should reuse the water so that they can use it multiple times, and that will help reduce the footprint. Hopefully, it's more efficient. And for us, I say, as a developer of this infrastructure projects, to increase supply, our challenge is always to look for better ways of doing it. In the case of Ulu Pandan, we over the years, I say halfway through our concession, we actually proposed to upgrade the plant to make it more efficient, achieve a higher recovery rate, so that effectively it's lowering carbon footprint. And then, I think that's and then we also put a solar panel over the plant to help whatever we can to reduce the amount of carbon that we need, because it's still Scope 2 energy that we're consuming.
Right. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, sorry, Scott. Yeah, just to interrupt. But coming back on what Mr. Tanju said there, if we look at Singapore, for instance, it's not just about recycling and desal. The third leg of the PUB and the PUB strategy, I can't speak on behalf of them, but as I understand it, is to actually reduce demand to avoid wastage. Now, using smart solutions, in Singapore, we've worked together with the PUB on a certain region of Singapore. So every customer, municipal customer in a certain area of Singapore, had access to their water demand on their smartphone. It had a remarkable impact. They realized how much they used from various activities. It reduced wastage during the evening as well, for instance. And we managed to show, on average, about a 6 to 7% reduction in domestic demand. Not by imposing anything, but just by educating the population on what they were using. So these smart solutions are very powerful.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Steve. That can go, I believe, a long way just in terms of minimal cost to old facilities to be able to upgrade and improve the overall effectiveness of water distribution. If we can maybe, as we're starting to talk about some of the uncertainty, I'm going to switch back to the larger panel and bring everybody back. And the last part of that was actually related to some of the uncertainty in different places, different location, and the scenarios are very different. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of the more sophisticated model, the more tools that we have to be able to model this out, you can see how sea level rise is not consistent globally. The impact in one location is very different from another one, depending on many different factors. You layer in then terrestrial change, that also changes quite a bit. So this brings up the question in terms of how do you deal with these different scenarios, and then when you project them over time, as we're starting to do, looking 20, 30, 40 years out, it changes a lot. So our ability to plan for the future is becoming harder and harder. And what is the scenario that you take? I mean, historically, you'd open up a guidebook and you'd build to the 1 in 50 year storm, 1 in 500 year storm. Like, you know, there's a defined measure to that. In this scenario planning, what does that scenario look like? And maybe I'll turn to the Mayor of Rotterdam to start with this in terms of their thinking around what does 1 year look like, 5 years, 10 years. Mayor, if I can have your comments on this. Oh, you'll have to come off mute just a second.
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah. We think in Rotterdam that a plan for 5 years or 10 years is not good enough. Our planning is for 100 years. 100 years. I was lucky last 2 terms of my position as mayor to work with the national government to conduct a study to see what our dikes and levees, for which we have more than 1,000 kilometers surrounding the city of Rotterdam, are good enough to sustain the future. And the result is yes, indeed, but not good enough for the long term. So we come up with a plan and that is accepted by the Dutch Parliament, for which the Dutch government is offering 1 billion euros a year, 1 billion euros a year to reinforce and to enlarge the dikes and levees surrounding the city of Rotterdam. So that's a huge amount of money. And we hope that we can continue to do that for 100 years. Simultaneously, we are some cautious about drinking water. We have enough water in the region, but we think that from 2050, the resources for drinking water will be less than we have now, partly affected by the North Sea in times of drought, that the salt water will penetrate under the ground so far till 50 kilometers land inwards. And we have some drinking water sources over there that we now forced to close for 90 days a year because of the effect of salt water coming from the North Sea. And the other economic problem is that when there is drought, that means that the level of the river, the Rhine, will shrink to a level that barges cannot go to Germany. And that is the way we bring from the refineries in Rotterdam gasoline to the factories in Germany. So we need to transport the gas and gasoline using trucks, which is not the most funny way to do. So our planning is really for the long term. And I would like to add something, talking in this forum with a couple of engineers representing the rich part of the world. We must be, I think, concerned about what is going on in the third world, where the resources are lower. It's really complicated when I speak to my colleagues all over the world, to explain to them that we can finance all this project because we have a certain designated taxation. So for water boards in the Netherlands, every citizen almost pays some 400 euros a year designated taxation for the water board to finance the water works. But for the sewer system, for instance, the citizens in my city pay the average of 200 euros a year to finance this project. It's very difficult in a lot of cities in the world for the local leaders to introduce taxation for water and water-related issues. It's there, I think, where the World Bank and the IMF and other international institutions must come in to facilitate and to help these countries and these large cities. Our friends in India, for instance, they face really big troubles when it comes to water and sewer systems to finance these products in the future. I will be happy to see that work, and if we can bring some knowledge into that system, how you can finance that through using small taxation system to make that work in terms of sewage and water harvesting and water cleaning, but also if you are a Delta City, how to protect the industry using new technologies of dikes and levees. We will be happy from Rotterdam to bring our knowledge in.
Right. Carlos, do you want to pick up on that, Ed?
Yeah, yes, just two comments. The first is, what is my view about the uncertainties in the future? And I absorbed probably in the last 2 years, and especially probably after COVID, that the uncertainty is something that we are not going to change. It's something that will join us for the next, I don't know if the next 100 years, as the mayor has mentioned, but it's something that is going to be in our lives for the future. And for me, has been a very good consequences in the scenario of the water sector, because has moved some of the sectors to move from the passive role to active role, especially in the industries and in the agricultural purposes, in which they have been for years waiting that utilities solve the problem of the water. And nowadays we see some good movements, for instance, in the Mediterranean, in which the agricultures has been decided that they want to be independent of the water resources to maintain the crops in the future, increasing, for instance, in Murcia, 25% of reuse in just 5 years, trying to follow up the exceptional cases that we have mentioned here in Israel and Singapore or whatever, which is not the general rule, okay? And the same for the industries that are trying to externalize the water sources and to be as much independent as they want, because they know that in the future, probably the priorities of the utilities will not be the industry. And then they are looking for a more independent role in his day-by-day business. This is the first one. My second point regarding that has been discussed many times is how the countries in developing are solving the future in the water sources, okay? I think that, and I developed many projects in Latin America, Africa, in Ghana, in Algeria, or in Kenya, okay? Then the priority for the drinking water has been difficult, but it's something that is a fact. And the PPP programs has been very well developed. But I think any other extensive as the wastewater treatment is not a priority, because I think the drinking water has been a priority in the past years. But nowadays, I starting to see which mechanisms we can implement, okay? It is clear that up to now we have not a clear regulation. Now probably with these new directives and probably to expand what has been done in Singapore, Israel, Spain, or any other countries, they have a rule clear to follow. But the second part, I think, is not the financial part, is not the technological part, is how these countries can give really the level of warranties to implement this kind of solutions for the future, okay? And it's something that is in the discussion from the World Bank and any other financial institutions. I don't think it's easy, and it's probably for me, the most complicated mechanism to solve in the future. Is something that has to, of course, be solved as we solved in the past the drinking water for the infra. But many of the companies are working in these solutions. I have not still the final mechanism, but of course the financial institutions have to help the developers to solve this issue, which at the end is the future water for any other water, not drinking water for any other issues as industrial or agriculture, which at the end is the 70-80% of the total consumption of the demand. That's my point.
But I guess, Carlos, in terms of, maybe Professor Kassan can expand on this related to the International Water Association. I mean, the ability to plan for uncertainty, it can go two ways, right? I mean, you could plan for something and it might not happen. But if it does happen, then the need to actually spend more is where the financial institutional part of the water industry is needed to be very robust. And the mayor, mentioned in terms of the $1 billion fund from the European group, also the taxation to be able to tax. Not every jurisdiction can do that. So I guess Professor Kassan, in terms of the International Water Association, is representative of 140 countries. Is there a mechanism to be able to do that with that uncertainty in mind in terms of being able to plan? I mean, it's kind of like going back from what you had pointed out before, from just in time to just in case. And how can we do that in a world of multiple countries that have limited access to resources?
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, we face different challenges and different magnitudes of challenges. Whilst we're all planning for uncertainty across the world, and as you mentioned, the IWA and all its different member countries and some of the great examples we've heard, I don't know that there's a silver bullet around this. Really, COVID, in addition to climate change, is teaching us so much about uncertainty, to the extent that when we had a conversation before, one time we used to believe that just in time was the way to build infrastructure. Well, many these days talk about just in case. Now, just in case might have become an old-fashioned concept, which was replaced by just in time. However, the other aspect that I think becomes important is that the world is really one place. The impact of COVID or climate change on some countries impacts other countries, impacts public health, impacts mobility, etc. So in terms of planning for uncertainty, I don't know that anybody's really got it perfectly right. Safe to say that some countries have done remarkably well at reducing water loss, at improving water recycling, at reduction on electricity in the classical sense, and of course, the notion of adaptive capacity. We know that some countries have an amazing adaptive capacity, which I think should be transfused in terms of skills, particularly to vulnerable communities in the African continent, Latin America, parts of Southeast Asia that don't have that capability, because the ability to rebound from a crisis, I think, becomes very important in our planning. Thank you for now.
Before we move on, does someone else want to add a comment to planning for uncertainty?
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we all talk about climate change, the uncertainties of climate change, as if it's something that is going to be very far out and we need to plan now. But the truth is, climate change is actually much closer than you think. Look at the headlines 4 days ago on ABC News. It says, the mega drought that's plaguing much of the Western US is a direct consequence of warming global temperatures, according to climate change experts. This was a headline 4 days ago. Climate change is already here. I think I just want to highlight that while it's, I think, easy for me to talk about, policy, regulatory innovations to consider, but really the hard part now is about how cities and jurisdictions is going to be able to actually up the game, working with industry, essentially to tackle climate change impact on water. And up the game they must. And likewise, I think the industry at large also need to figure out how we can step forward and in the end actually help cities and jurisdictions to really enhance resilience. And I would like again to us to consider reiterating a few areas we should focus on mines in terms of industrial collaboration to deal with climate change. One, on demand tracking and management, all with the aim of reducing water usage footprint. Two, recycling with industries and then at the city and national level. And three, development, testing and fielding of the latest smart technologies to reduce energy use in water treatment and delivery. Ultimately, all this will help us, I think, bring about better resilience against climate change uncertainties, which I must say is already here.
Thank you, Min Long. Boon Lang, you have a...
I thought since everybody's talking about the regulatory and authorities planning perspective, I thought maybe I'll bring in also the private sector's perspective on potential change. Ours is always the technological change, so we also need the authority to recognize that, because sometimes when you adopt a certain technology that you have a concession for the next 20, 30 years, but because of technology advancement, that you may need to change. Like I said, today's some of this thermal plant that's producing dissemination and all that, maybe less and less acceptable going forward, and people have to change. And then under the contract, how do we manage that? Or in the planning cycle, what do you do with that?
Right. Thank you. Actually, just picking up Minlung, from your comment, there's a question from one of the participants, which partly has to do with the reuse of drinking water, but it's more along the lines of stakeholder engagement. So the question is, what are cities doing to engage with citizens regarding the acceptability of reuse for drinking water? It's a perceptual issue for many, and the comment in Singapore, citizens appear to be very proud of what their country has achieved, especially with recycled water coming back into the drinking system. Would somebody like to take that from a citizens engagement perspective?
I think this is really
Who would like to start?
This will be a great question for PUB, but I must say, given my previous experience, I think engagement is something that needs to be done with, I would say, with a long-term plan, with persistence, and I would say you need to plug at it, because at the end of the day, we need to change mindsets. We need to basically change the perception that recycling is a water resource, a water source that you can use, not something that for you to figure how to get rid of the wastewater. And I think this really is something that I think cities and jurisdictions really need to pay attention to if they want to make recycling very much part and parcel of the larger water ecosystem.
I may add something to that. In Rotterdam so far, it's not really urgent, as we have really plenty of water, rivers, and also other sources where we keep the water or harvest the rainwater in what we call the Bispos. It's a natural area, southern part of Rotterdam. It's really sufficient enough for water, and it's still a very cheap commodity. I don't know whether you have an idea how much I pay every month. I had my annual bill last week's. My water bill for a household of 3 in a small garden is 27 euros. 27 euros. So the annual bill is about 300 euros with some tax above that. So it's not really a big issue. We have a lot of drinking water and it's a cheap commodity. But things may change, and I think to prepare for that. In 2040, 2050, we may be having new concerns concerning drinking water. So that's why we collect through a double pipe system what we call the gray water, to use it for gardening and for the toilets in the new areas, but also for the industry. And that's so far good enough. So the cleaning of water is a good industry, but there is not a high urgency nowadays to come up with a communication strategy for citizens to help them to rethink that drinking recycled water maybe will be an option, not now.
Right. Actually, a lot of cities just drinking out of the tap water, which is perfectly fine in many places, is still perceived to be not good quality water. So I think there's a lot of things to do around there. Yeah. Maybe if I can shift now, and I want to ask a question around carbon sequestration, and tie this into the idea of changing climate, because managing climate change, a lot of the global work is around bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, keeping rising temperatures in check. Lifting and moving, transporting water has a huge energy load. And, this is in almost every city in terms of how water is actually moved in terms of supply or treated at the end of the cycle. So what are some of the areas of innovation? Can net zero water be achieved? Is that an achievable goal? And I think maybe, Steve, we can start with you and the experience with Suez. Can we achieve net zero water with your portfolio as a starting point?
Well, yes, we can, if we have sufficient government support and population support for that. It's the technology exists, full stop. You introduced me as being responsible for water. I'm also responsible for the waste in Asia as well. But in Suez, we don't actually call it waste. We call it recycling and recovery. So it's not a waste product, none of this. It's a resource that can be further used. However, if we move back to water, I'll give you an example, a real concrete example in Chile, in Santiago, where we work closely with the government through our subsidiary Aguas Andinas. In 2005, only 3 or 4% of the sewage was actually treated. So there was a huge need for infrastructure, big infrastructure. Now, that was finished within about 10 years. But then in 2017, we decided, once again with the support of the government, to create what we call a biofactory. There are 3 large sewage treatment plants supplying the entire population of Santiago. So on the basis that we are treating the incoming sewage as a resource, we've managed to implement the technology to use everything that comes into that system. So even the sand, there's a lot of sand comes into sewage treatment. During the separation process, the sand is actually removed and it's used by the city in construction projects. We then use the thermal energy from the incoming sewage and from the treatment process, and we produce something like 84 gigawatt hours of thermal energy from that. We use the gravity coming in from the sewerage system. We produce electricity from that, and we produce natural gas, something like 84 gigawatt hours from the treatment process, from the carbon source, of course. So by having a mindset that everything is a resource, you can introduce carbon neutrality. Now, we're almost there in Santiago. This is a big city, and by 2022, we will be carbon neutral of the sewage treatment process in Santiago, and probably carbon positive. We'll actually be contributing towards the energy supply of the city. So the technology exists, Scott, without any doubt whatsoever. It's just, okay, it comes down to finance, of course, but support from both government and private sector. So yes, well, the answer is yes.
So maybe on that, Richard, you could come into the discussion here on the finance part. If it comes down to finance, I mean, what are you seeing in terms of innovation to allow for net zero? I know that, I mean, technology-wise, we're close on many parts, but if it's a financial part, what's happening in terms of helping that?
So firstly, I'm with Steve that there's really no sort of technological breakthroughs needed to achieve net zero, not just across water, but across huge sectors of the infrastructure landscape. And equally, I would argue that there's no intrinsic shortage of finance in order to be able to achieve it either. What is missing is the mechanisms that apply that finance to where it is needed. And the big challenge, as I think we all know, is that across water and indeed across energy and across transport as well, if anything, the financial incentives are often running the wrong way. And we have institutionalized systems which are continuing to encourage businesses and consumers to use carbon emission solutions rather than carbon reducing solutions. And that really, I think, is the world's big challenge. There's absolutely no shortage of private capital that is keen to invest in this space. Indeed, arguably, it has been the private equity capital providers who have been the strongest nudge towards private businesses to start to decarbonize, because they have recognized earlier than other businesses the extent to which public opinion is focused on the ESG footprint of their activities, and they in turn are increasingly turning the thumb screws on businesses to step up as well. In terms of things we need to do, I spoke before about the introduction of things like wastewater reuse certification. We need to create these sorts of dynamic markets that allow companies that do the right thing to actually start to financially benefit from it. And then actually bringing the solutions that are required into play. I think we should do a lot more around encouraging unsolicited proposals from the private sector.
Yeah, actually, I mean, for that, actually interesting, I think, Rotterdam, if I can bring the mayor in on this, Richard, Rotterdam, recently did a $2.56 billion award for sustainable projects, which was aimed at storing carbon in the port. Now, this is more oil and gas type of related, but I'd be interested to know, Mayor, if you're starting to look at similar private-public partnerships with water systems in Rotterdam in terms of that carbon storage or net carbon neutral.
I listened carefully to our friends from Suez arguing that the technology is there, but the availability of technology is not enough. We have the responsibility to shape a city, so to use all the instruments, but also to use the acceptance of our citizens to new technologies. And let me give you a number of issues. And the philosophy in Rotterdam, not only in Rotterdam, I'm also the chair of the region. And after this meeting, I will be chairing the new meeting for this month with my colleagues in the region, talking about building some 200,000 houses for the coming 25 years. And the idea is that all these houses will not use energy. They will deliver energy. So they will use solar systems. That's about 5,000 euros per household. There will be subsidies. But what to do with apartments and apartment buildings? And we're lucky in Rotterdam to build, like Singapore, very high apartments, floors up to 200 floors. So then technology would not be enough per household to deliver enough energy. On the other hand, if you do that on a very massive scale, you need to renew your grids. For that purpose, our grids company last month asked the participants, and the city of Rotterdam is one of the participants in the as a shareholder, to come up with large contributions to renew that grid. That will be just for the city of Rotterdam, €500 million, of which the city of Rotterdam will contribute some 100 million euros in the capital of that system to renew the grid. Otherwise, the grid is not used to use electricity in two directions. Then the houses will be built in a way that they will not lose any water. The water will be collected in a way to be reused for washing, for gardening, for the toilets, and if there is some remaining water, must disappear in the ground surrounding the house instead of delivering it into the grid, into the water, the sewage system. So it's more than technology. It's really shaping a city in a way that government and developers and the owners of the houses must contribute in a proper way. But the city has a composition. It is what it is. You cannot demolish the city and build it the way you want it. So we have to shape the city in a way that we gradually use technology, but also use the will of the citizens to participate. We cannot force citizens, say, you must have solar system and you will have a loan of 5,000 euros. And of course, we'll help you with some 2,000 euros, but we're not living into such a system. We know systems like that in the world, but it's not here. So we have to move gradually towards the new thing. And I give my city from now 25 years.
25 years to get to net zero.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a commitment there.
As you might know, the houses that we have, they have a life cycle of 100 years. So within 25 years, a lot of very old houses will be demolished and replaced by new ones. And that's the opportunity that we have the coming years to work gradually to that system.
Right. Yeah, I mean, on the net zero within water, our water systems used to be gravity fed, and it's only in the last 100 years or so where we've started to use a lot of power to move that around. So I could see the shift back to more of a Roman aqueduct, if you want, type of structure for the cities in terms of how we move our water around. I mean, overall, the discussion today has been very fascinating. I think we've gone through both policy aspects. We've also touched on many different physical changes that could happen, as well as some possibilities in terms of ways in which this is funded or financed, and through some very large trends and changes in the water industry. With that, we're coming to an end of the session. And what I'd like to ask from our speakers is to summarize their vision for the future for the water sector in the next 3 to 5 years. And what would be your call to action for the audience today for them to help in terms of being able to provide better resilience in our water infrastructure space? And with that, I will start with Richard. Richard, could you give your final comments, please?
Well, the thing I love about a call for action in everything to do with the ESG space is we can always ask on everybody both to act in their private lives in a particular way, but also do everything that they can within their professional capacity. And my call to arms, therefore, is to do both. I think we all have an obligation to recycle and reuse everything we can, and that is clearly in the topic of this debate about how we use water. In the context of the companies that individuals represent, I think the net zero aspirations and commitments that we've heard from many companies over the last few years, we're now at a point where every company, every business in the sector needs to have both made that commitment, but moreover now need to move to actually working out how they are going to do it. There are too many businesses out there that are making the pronouncements but have absolutely no idea how they are going to get to that solution. So my ask, my takeaway would be to start to actually move into the implementation thinking of how you will get to net zero, and specifically in water, how you will get to the point where you are recycling as much of it as possible.
Thank you, Richard. Mr. Tan, over to you for your final comments.
Right. Let's say our focus will be my view on more of efficiency. Let's say we consume less water, less energy, and essentially more efficiently. And going forward, let's say it's not going to be less challenging. It will certainly be more exciting for the industry. And in the circular system, we would like to see more recycling of water to supplement the water supply systems and make every drop count. And if we have more government and authorities to adopt the DBO or DBO structures to invite private participation to address the challenge, that'd be good. And then, let's say if we do it right, we should be able to deliver clean water to all people in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kazan, your comments? You have to come off mute first. There we go.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think for the future challenges, the roadmap is clear. I think we have discussed that to improve the reuse, to reduce as much as possible the energy efficiency or increase the efficiency, and to reduce as much as possible the CO2 emissions. But for me, the main two barriers that we have the sector to complete with this awareness, which is not probably in the companies that are developing projects, so in the responsibility of the city, the government that is taking the decisions, is for me there are two important problems that is putting these barriers. The first is I have the feeling still that there is a lack of education about the water value in the citizens. Then I will ask for more programs to educate the real value of the water for the future. The lack of the water is a fact, and I don't think that we have still the feeling that we have to take care enough the value of the water. And the second and is the main concern for me is the lack of political will to implement the necessary tools. Why we have done in the telecommunications or in the oil and gas, and the sector, which is something fundamental for the future, has not the same support from the political advance. Okay, this is the two messages that probably put the main challenges for the future from my view.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Professor Kassan?
Thank you, Scott. My vision for the next 3 to 5 years would be to see resilient cities and communities led by governments and utilities in partnership with business, capable of ensuring access of good quality and quantity of water on a sustainable basis, overcoming challenges of climate and other uncertainties, a water-wise world in which water is fully appreciated and respected. After all, water is life. Thank you.
Thank you. Very concise, and it sounds like that could be the starting point to the climate resilient policy for all of South Africa. Thank you. And Mr. Chu, your
thanks.
final comments?
If you ask me what the vision going 3 to 5 years ahead, I think very simply will be one where I think I like to see tremendously higher level of collaboration between cities and jurisdictions with industry. Again, just to up the game, to be able to deal with, I think, the challenge of climate change on water resources. And I already mentioned in terms of where the areas we think we can have that collaboration. But more importantly, at the end of the 3 to 5 years, I think, I hope that cities and jurisdictions can be much more ready for what essentially is the impact of climate change on water. And I must say very clearly, I think the impact will be coming sooner rather than later. So we need to act now.
Right. Completely agree. The impact is actually happening now, to your earlier point.
Yeah.
And finally, Mayor, your vision moving forward?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having the opportunity to exchange views with my colleagues all over the world. And you know, my name is Ahmed Abu Talib, and that's not a typical Dutch name. That suggests that I'm coming from elsewhere in the world, and indeed, I'm an African boy. I'm born in Africa, from two Moroccan Moroccans, a father and a mother. So I'm a full African boy, and I know how it is to live with little water. And one of the main reasons to migrate to the Netherlands in the 70s was lack of water. I had to walk with a donkey for 7 kilometers through mountains to look for 50 liters of drinking water. So I really have an idea what it is to have little water to live. And without water, no life. And I'm now living in a rich world, and I have the lucky opportunity to lead one of the largest cities in the world concerning the ports, and now in the added value for water, to have one of the wonderful ports in the world. From that perspective, I really know that water is not a sexy theme for politics. I repeat, it's not a sexy theme for politics. So my takeout for today is, how can we make water really a sexy theme in politics? Don't forget, when I was 25 working for the Dutch Ministry of Health, I learned that the most interesting solution for the most aggressive diseases in the world was not the discovery of medicines. It was because the world understood how to make sewage system. So water, make it sexy, and build enough sewage systems in the world to eradicate diseases.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's a challenge to the SIWW organizers to make water sexier for next year. And to figure out a way to do that. So thank you. And I would really like to thank the panel. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion today. Hopefully our audience has taken away a few implementable solutions wherever you're calling in from that can help us safeguard our urban water systems against shocks caused by climate uncertainty that you know is coming in your own communities that you may already be dealing with, or it's on the immediate horizon. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'll hand it back to Ryan and the organizers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, and our speakers for the insightful sharing and meaningful discussions. This brings our session to a close. Next up will be an exclusive in-conversation session with the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Heng Swee Keat. This session is jointly organized with the World City Summit and Asia Infrastructure Forum. It will begin at 5 p.m. Singapore time. As there is still some time before the session begins, do head over to our Water Expo to check out the products, services, and solutions on offer. We will see you shortly.